Hello, I'm Roberto Baldwin, and this is Tomorrow Today's Sustainable Mobility Brief. The transportation world is evolving at a rate not seen in decades. The transition from fossil fuels to sustainable energy has brought with it some truly exciting opportunities, but also some confusion. I'll sift through the noise and share quick updates on the latest news, trends, and advancements that will impact our world for years to come. This week on the Tomorrow Today Briefs podcast, we have Andrew Wishnia with Boundary Stone Partners. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about something that's complex and there's a lot of confusion around it.
I'm looking forward to helping.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, also known as NEVI. Can you quickly tell us what NEVI's goals are and what it means for electric vehicles?
Sure. Roberto, thanks so much for having me on your podcast. NEVI program, or the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, is a $5 billion program that goes toward EV charging infrastructure. It's a formula program, which means that there's no discretion in law as to who gets what allocations of funding. The apportionment is distributed by formula. And it's actually the same formula that is distributed to states for other programs under the Federal Aid Highway Program. So generally speaking, with some exceptions, it's the same program that funds the roads, highways, and bridges across the country. The NEVI program's analog on a discretionary basis is the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Program. So that program is a grant program that has eligibility for EVs, hydrogen, natural gas, and propane. We also created a formula program, so its counterpart, that is strictly for EVs. And 4/5 of that funding has been made available to state departments of transportation. And this October would be the 5th year of funding under the bipartisan infrastructure law that funding would be available for. So that's the program, and the goal is to create, a convenient, accessible, and reliable charging network, so people have the option of what fuel to use when they choose a trip that requires or that they want to drive. So it's not a requirement. There's no mandate whatsoever. It's merely an option for folks to use funds that are available through this formula program to be able to deploy charging infrastructure. And the last thing that I would say, Roberto, and I think we might get into this with a little more specificity, is if states don't want to use those dollars, they don't have to actually under this apportionment. It instead can get reallocated to cities within that state. I don't think we've gotten quite there yet, but these programs take a while to build out. But that is sort of an option if a state doesn't want to use the dollars prescribed to it. It doesn't have to. So there's no requirement. It's just an option for a growing segment of America that chooses to drive electric.
So if your state doesn't want to use it, you don't have to. The cities can use it, but for states that do want to sort of build out this infrastructure, there's money there that helps the state, that helps the individual companies or the large corporations or whoever wants to help build out this infrastructure.
That's exactly right. And Roberto, just to drill down on that a little bit, every single state in the country as a condition precedent of getting these apportioned dollars was required to produce a plan. So states didn't even have to produce plans if they didn't want these dollars. Mm-hmm. And through the great work of the team at the U.S. Department of Transportation, the Department of Energy, and throughout the interagency, including the Joint Office, every single state in the country produced a plan. Mm-hmm. And that includes Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. Every single state produced a plan ahead of deadline. I think because at the end of the day, people don't think about deploying charging infrastructure just for environmental reasons. They deploy charging infrastructure for tourism, for manufacturing, for jobs, to take advantage of a new burgeoning sector of the economy. It's not a question of, if we get to, electrification. It's a question of when.
Hmm.
And we are here. And so we want to make sure that we're providing that option for people to travel with this fuel choice.
And now, recent executive orders seem to have put the program and its funding on hold, but there seems to be some confusion about what the executive orders mean. And can the president stop funding allocated by Congress? I mean, it's allocated by it's a bipartisan. Can they do that? Is that what's going on?
You're right, Roberto, that this was an extraordinarily bipartisan effort. When I was on the Environment and Public Works Committee, we had staff on a bipartisan basis that negotiated every single provision that was in the base bill of the bipartisan infrastructure law. And for folks that don't recall, the base bill happened actually during the first Trump administration. So it was the Trump administration themselves that provided, the latitude to be able to negotiate from the Republican side of the House. And so we negotiated with Senator Barrasso and his staff, Senator Capito and her staff, Senator Cardin and his staff, and then on behalf of Senator Carper, we negotiated a four corners bill that received, extremely bipartisan sentiment and votes that was passed into law. My sense of both the memo that was released by the U.S. Department of Transportation by this Trump administration and the executive order is there's some things that are totally within, the scope of the law and are the prerogative of the Trump administration. I think the axiom elections have consequences holds true here. So, whether I agree with it or not, they absolutely have the right to pull down guidance and to issue new guidance. They absolutely have the right, to revise regulation. What they don't have, obviously, the power to do is to do something that's inconsistent with a law, and that is what is being adjudicated now, because the NEVI statute, to our prior conversation, prescribes the way in which funds are to be dispersed if a state Department of Transportation doesn't produce a plan. But there's no pausing or withholding of apportionments or additional conditionality provided in the NEVI statute. And I think that's why you're seeing so many folks from both sides of the aisle who are concerned about the way not only in which this program is being implemented within the first few weeks of this administration, but the programs, across the transportation and infrastructure funding landscape.
And so now, what does this mean for companies or locations that are already in the middle of deploying charging stations? If you're, you hear about like Flying J, Buc-ee's, or even, small places that are working with like Electrify America or ChargePoint, if they, are sort of like, oh, we're going to get this funding, we're going to build this charging stations, is that put on hold? Do they still get the funding? Like, should these people be concerned, or should they say, okay, I need to finish the thing I'm doing?
Maybe both and. So there should absolutely be concern, because the law prescribes an apportionment once a condition has been satisfied, and that condition has been satisfied by every state, DC and Puerto Rico. So they are entitled to their apportionment, and that apportionment has been paused. So there absolutely should be concern, because they are duly entitled to the funding provided by the federal government via the enactment of the bipartisan infrastructure law. I think what it means is two things. One is what the administration has said is any project that has been obligated, those projects can move forward. And I think their interpretation of obligation, which is a federal commitment to enter into a project, their interpretation is for any project level obligation, they will fulfill reimbursement. So that's the way that the NEVI program works, is it's reimbursement based. And for everything else, that's paused. So if you don't currently, and again, Roberto, this is just my interpretation of the memo, from their perspective, which is that if you don't have a project agreement or obligation, then you can't proceed. Which means, to your point, there are, a lot of projects out there that either have disturbed land or which, the state DOT was expecting, remittance from the federal government that just hasn't been provided yet. So
Mhm.
it's both, ineffective and inefficient
Mhm.
to turn, the faucet on and off. And it also is, unhelpful for state departments of transportation who had planned for deploying this infrastructure in coordination with the private sector for years at this point,
Mhm.
to have to recalibrate. But I think the expectation right now is a little unclear because it's working its way through courts. But the clear intent of the program, within the confines of the law, is to distribute, funding for EV charging and to have that distributed over the course of the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was from fiscal years 2022 to 2026.
Because it seems like this could affect a lot of people who may have been offered jobs to help, build out these locations, whether via the government, whether via private parties, and then suddenly maybe those jobs are on hold. Which, if you don't have a job, you can't wait for a job. You start looking for another job, so you might lose those people, or maybe cancel just because there is confusion around this.
That's absolutely right. I think this impacts the manufacturing sector. It certainly impacts the automotive sector, which is why you've seen, folks like the CEO of GM, come out against these types of policies and in positions from the administration. It affects, the tourism industry. It certainly affects the way that we travel because whether you're, Republican or Democrat, more and more folks are buying EV. And so it provides them less choice. Again, there's no mandate or no requirement. We just wanted to provide an additional option for
Mhm.
people to move, either goods or people. And, because electrification tends to be more cost effective, it augurs, to the disadvantage of the taxpayer who wants to lower, operating and maintenance costs as well.
And so, how do you think this will affect the sort of the rollout of the charging infrastructure, both short term and long term? Is this merely a short term problem, or is this something that we're going to be feeling for the next 5, 10 years? In your opinion?
So the NEVI program, just to get a little technical, was done under a type of budget authority called appropriated budget authority, which means that Congress provided upfront capital to deploy charging infrastructure. Generally, the process is that on a year-to-year basis, an agency asks more money to deploy a program. That's not the case with the NEVI program. This was
Mhm.
advanced appropriations. So these funds should be secure. And, the president and the administration are required to implement the law as it was prescribed. So just within the confines of the law, these, funds should be secure absent congressional intervention. And because the bill was done on a bipartisan basis, my sense is that that wasn't, the most appealing thing to rescind, given the fact that Republicans and Democrats, both agreed,
Mhm.
to these provisions. So I think, just in terms of looking at the four corners of the law, it should be secure. I think the, additional discussion here has to do with the fact that we're dealing with a policy that appears to, to flatly, be contrary to what's prescribed in the law.
Mhm.
So I think the long answer to your question is we just don't know because I think the administration has two choices. One is to either allow those funds to continue to flow as was required by the law, and then the second option is to exercise its options in court and provoke a court to require it to do so.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew. I really appreciate it. I know this is an incredibly confusing topic. I know a lot of folks, a lot of companies, a lot of individuals out there are just trying to figure this out. And I really appreciate you taking time to chat with us about it.
Yeah, of course. And Roberto, if I might just say, I think the headlines here are, the NEVI program, the CFI program. We did provide charging infrastructure eligibility throughout the federal aid highway program. So there are additional opportunities for folks to be leveraging funding for, hydrogen refueling, EV charging, other alternative fueling
Mhm.
charging infrastructure is available outside of these programs. Hopefully, and eventually, we will see the law followed as it was intended. But in the meantime, we at Boundaries and partners are here to help folks navigate that process. And I really appreciate the opportunity to just provide a little background into the topic.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
For more information about the evolution of sustainability, head on over to sustainablecareers.sae.org. There you can check out the first drive of the new 2025 Ioniq 5, the first non-Tesla EV to hit the road with SAE J3400, aka NACS, aka the Tesla Portal.
SAE International makes no representations as to the accuracy of the information presented in this podcast. The information and opinions are for general information only. SAE International does not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast.